took just over 4 minutes for this aircraft to lose control and fall nearly 38,000 feet. That's roughly the same time it takes to toast a piece of bread. What were the crucial details that caused this accident? Stay tuned. The crew who were going to operate Air France Flight 447 arrived in Rio de Janeiro from Paris on the 28th of May 2009. They were scheduled for a 3-day stop in Rio before the return flight back to Paris. We know very little about how they spent their time during this layover, but what is known is that the first officer, who was later going to be pilot flying of this flight, had brought his wife with him for the trip. Given that, it's unlikely that at least he spent the whole day before the flight resting, and there were indications that this might also apply to the other pilots. Flight 447 was scheduled to depart at 8 in the evening Rio time. That would be 11 o'clock at night Paris time, and that meant that the crew would have to operate through the night on the way home, with a scheduled landing time in Paris around midday on the 1st of June. This would mean that the pilots would have to operate throughout the window of circadian law, a time of night during which it's especially hard for the human body and mind to stay alert. Because of this and the fact that the flight was scheduled to last 12 hours and 45 minutes, the flight crew had been augmented with an extra pilot to allow for scheduled rest during the flight back. This meant that there were 3 pilots who were going to fly together, 1 captain and 2 first officers. The captain was 58 years old and had a total flying experience of 11,000 hours, 1,700 of which was flown as a pilot in command on the Airbus A330. The first officer was 32 years old. He was the least experienced of the crew, with 3,000 hours in total and 800 on the type. He had done his type rating on the Airbus A330 and 340 in 2008, the year before the flight. The third pilot, which I will refer to in this video as the relief pilot, was a 37-year-old first officer. He had a total time of 6,500 hours, but he was actually the most experienced on the type, with 4,500 hours flown on it. He had flown very little during the previous 3 months before the flight because he was also working as a management pilot in Air France. Prior to operating the flight, the pilots met up and reviewed the planning documentation, including weather, flight plans and NOTAMs. The weather was fine for the departure and in Paris, but the en route weather looked a bit more complicated. Since the flight would be crossing the equator, it would also be crossing an area over the Atlantic known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the ITCZ. In this zone, the easterly trade winds from the northern and southern hemisphere will converge and can force the humid air from the surface of the sea upwards. This can cause powerful thunderstorms that can reach as high as 60,000 feet, which is much higher than most aircraft can fly. This also means that the aircraft who have to fly through this zone might be subject to flying between and sometimes even through part of these storm clouds. The storms, who are formed over water in the ITCZ, can sometimes contain smaller water content than the storms that form over land, making them harder to see on the aircraft's weather radar, so pilots need to be very careful when navigating around them, since they could still be quite severe. The pilots likely discussed this risk of encountering these type of storms and carried a bit of extra fuel to give them the option of navigate around these storms if needed. The pilots also briefed their 9 cabin crew about the possibility of turbulence and the effect that might have on their service. Before we leave the discussion of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, we need to talk a little bit about the types of precipitation that can be found inside of these types of thunderstorms. Most people are familiar with the heavy rain and sometimes hail that typically come out of these clouds, but as you look higher up through the clouds, things can become a bit more complicated. Because of the very strong currents inside of the cloud, water droplets can be forced upwards into very cold air and become supercooled. This means that they are still in water form, but as soon as they hit the surface of some sort, they will instantly freeze and create clear ice. Sometimes these supercooled droplets can collide with snowflakes, and when that happens, a type of soft ice crystals can be formed, which is not as hard as hail, but big enough to be heard when it hits the aircraft if you fly through it. This type of precipitation doesn't create the type of heavy airframe icing that super cold rain does, but it has significant volume and can quickly clog up and overwhelm sensors and probes on the aircraft, especially the Pitot probes, which I will explain later. More than 9 different occurrences of this type of clogging happening to Air France flights had been reported during 2008 and 2009, and these reports, together with how to recognize and deal with the issues, had been published in safety bulletins circulated to all Air France pilots during the year before the accident flight. The aircraft that the pilots were going to operate was a reasonably new Airbus A330-203. It had been delivered to Air France in 2005 and was in almost perfect working order on the evening of the departure. Prior to arriving to the aircraft, the pilots ordered 70.4 tons of fuel to be loaded, and together with their cabin crew they walked out to the aircraft and started preparing it for departure. Now, it will be impossible to explain what happened on this flight without also explaining a few details about this Airbus, but also a little bit about flying in general. Pilots need a way to accurately measure the amount of air that is flowing over the wings, because that's what really determines the performance of the aircraft. To do this, they utilize a type of probe known as a Pitot tube or a Pitot probe. These probes are often situated along the front of the aircraft below the cockpit, and they look a little bit like gun barrels, and they have a hole in the front where the air enters and the total pressure is then measured inside of the tube. They are electrically heated, and the heating is automatic on the Airbus A330. But in order to accurately measure the airspeed, the static pressure must also be measured, so it can be deducted from the total pressure from the Pitot probes. This static pressure is measured from a different device called a static port, and that static pressure is then used both for calculating the airspeed and, crucially, also the altitude of the aircraft. These different pressures are then sent to the aircraft computers called Air Data Modules or ADMs. The ADMs will calculate the correct true airspeed, but another thing that will become hugely important in this story is that the static pressure from the static port must be corrected depending on how fast the aircraft is flying. That's because the air flows over the aircraft surfaces surrounding the static port and will therefore create localized pressure differences depending on the speed. These corrections are done automatically by the ADM computers, and because airspeed and altitude are critical values, there are 3 different independent sets of probes and computers fitted to the aircraft. Now, because of the problems that Air France and other operators had reported of ice crystals clogging up the Pitot probes, Airbus had started to look into the problem. A newer type of Pitot probe had been found to be more effective in preventing these problems, and a maintenance bulletin had been issued suggesting an upgrade to these newer probes. Air France had just started upgrading their first Airbus A330 about 1 month prior to the departure of Flight 447, and the accident aircraft was actually scheduled to have its probes changed on its arrival to Paris after the flight. But why was the change of these Pitot probes just a suggested action? Why wasn't it mandatory? Well, that's because the temporary loss of airspeed due to this issue was both very rare, it only lasted for a maximum of a couple of minutes, and there was a defined procedure which the pilots were supposed to follow in case it happened. In Air France, this procedure was known as IS de tous, but I will refer to it in this story as unreliable airspeed. Because this problem had been reported several times, it had been included in the recurrent training scenario for all Air France crews during 2008 and 2009. The training had included airspeed unreliable exercises, but only at low altitude. That's because that was seen as more safety critical because of the closeness to the terrain, but the performance of the aircraft was also much better than it would be at high altitude. Airspeed unreliable can be very tricky to diagnose because the failure will look different depending on what caused it and how severe it is. During the exercises that Air France crews had practiced, the autopilot did not disconnect and there were no warnings sounding in the cockpit when the failure occurred. Now, the airspeed unreliable procedure included the use of memory items, meaning safety critical items that needed to be done straight away from memory of the pilots. But using them was optional depending on the situation, and that had been interpreted as only needed if the aircraft was close to the ground. Also important for this story is that none of the pilots of Flight 447 had received any recent training on how to deal with an approach to stall and recovery, especially at high altitude. The latest stall training that they had actually received was done during their type rating on the Airbus A320, which they had all done years earlier. And that initial training that they had done was all done at low altitude, in which heavy emphasis was put on the use of thrust to recover the aircraft and power it out of the stall, achieving it with minimum altitude loss. Decreasing the pitch was a secondary action to take. Now, this idea that the engines will have enough power to pull an aircraft out of an extreme high angle of attack is also going to become very important. Once the 216 passengers had finished boarding and the crew were ready, the pilots asked for pushback and started moving away from their gate at time 22:09 UTC, only 9 minutes behind schedule. The first officer was pilot flying and all 3 pilots were present in the cockpit as they were taxiing out. At time 22:29, the aircraft started rolling down the runway in Rio de Janeiro and performed a completely normal takeoff. They climbed away along their clear departure route, which led them up through a northeasterly course following the coastline of Brazil. At some point after passing 20,000 feet climbing, the relief pilot left the cockpit to start his scheduled rest period, which would last about 3 hours. He went back into the crew rest compartment, which consisted of 2 bunk beds just behind the cockpit, and we don't know exactly when he left the cockpit, because the cockpit voice recordings from the cockpit voice recorder doesn't start until just after midnight UTC time. In any case, the 2 remaining pilots received clearance to climb to their initial cruise altitude of flight over 350, 35,000 feet, and once they were established in cruise, they were talking to controllers from BRASILEIRA FIR, and then later they switched over to Recife control. And it was Recife control who were going to be the last ones to have radar contact with the flight, because in that control area they were largely still flying over land, but once they passed into the next FIR, Atlántico, they would move away from radar coverage and instead be following oceanic traffic separation procedures. Now, flights over oceanic areas requires special training, procedures and aircraft equipment. Since the curvature of the Earth makes VHF radio communication impossible, aircraft are equipped with something called HF radios. These radios use layers in the ionosphere to bounce the signals off from and can therefore reach much further distances. As the aircraft passed an RNAV point called INTOL, the pilots checked in with Atlántico control on one of the 2 HF frequencies that they had been given. The pilots then tried to log into a new system that was being tested at the time in the area called ADS-C. This system would use automatic reports sent by the aircraft itself via satellite to update the position of the aircraft to ATC, thus showing where it was even if they didn't have radar coverage. Another cool thing that this new system could do was that it would immediately send a report if an aircraft deviated from the course or altitude that it had been assigned. But unfortunately, due to a formatting error in the flight plan that had been filed, the pilots were unable to log into this new system, and therefore, as soon as the aircraft left conventional radar coverage, it would not be able to be accurately tracked anymore, something that would come to have grave consequences. The Airbus A330 is a fly-by-wire aircraft, and that means that the inputs that the pilots make on their side stick and rudders will be electronically interpreted by a computer and then sent to the hydraulic flight control actuators for execution. This type of controls comes with many benefits. For example, it makes the aircraft substantially lighter, but mainly it allows the aircraft to monitor certain safety parameters and make sure that those parameters aren't exceeded. Parameters like excessive bank and pitch angles are monitored, as well as safeguarding the maximum and minimum speeds, and a whole load of other parameters as well. Now, detractors of the system say that this lets the aircraft have the final word of the pilots, but that's not completely true. Only maneuvers which are really extreme and ultimately dangerous are blocked by the system, but the fly-by-wire system do require that the pilots who operate them really understand how they work and when those protections actually work and don't. This is true for all aircraft obviously, but it's especially true here. And why is that? Well, in order for these protections to properly work, the computers who monitor them needs to be absolutely sure that they are using correct parameters to start with. If that is not the case, the computers will back off and take away those protections simply because the computers aren't really sure what's going on. These computers receive their inputs from a lot of different sources, like the Pitot probes, the static ports, the inertial reference units, angle of attack vanes, and so on. They combine all of this data into 3 air data reference units, who together form the Air Data Inertial Reference System. As long as all 3, or at least 2, of these ADRs agree with each other, the aircraft control computers are happy, and it can continue to operate in what's called normal law. Normal law means that all protections are available and that the aircraft is basically impossible to stall or put into an upset situation. But if 2 or more ADRs start sending strange information, a couple of things will quickly happen. First of all, these inconsistencies might affect the autoflight system, like the autopilot that controls the aircraft, the auto throttle governing the engines, and the flight directors who are showing the pilots how to fly. That's quite logical if you think about it. The aircraft will not try to navigate or control the aircraft if it's not sure about what's going on. It will leave that up to the pilots to figure it out. And following up on that same logic, the aircraft control computers will degrade from normal law into either alternate law 1 or alternate law 2, depending on the severity of the issues. The difference between normal law and alternate law 2, which will soon become relevant in this flight, is that the protections that the aircraft normally have regarding maximum angle of attack or stall protection will no longer be available. This will be shown by the removal of warning indicators like the barber's pole on the primary flight display, as well as yellow crosses where the limitations would normally be shown. The other difference is that the roll control of the aircraft changes. In normal law and alternate law 1, the roll inputs on the side stick will command a specific roll rate from the aircraft. If the pilot inputs a specific roll rate to be kept, the aircraft will give that and gust disturbances will be compensated for. It will basically be very stable and easy to handle. But in alternate law 2, the side stick will give direct commands to the ailerons and spoilers rather than commanding a specific roll rate. This means no bank protections or stability control. This will also make the aircraft more roll sensitive, especially at higher altitudes where there's less aerodynamic damping due to the thinner air. Another major difference between a conventional aircraft and an Airbus fly-by-wire aircraft is the pitch trim system. If you're flying manually in a conventional aircraft, the yoke controls the flight controls directly and the trim has to be done deliberately by the pilots. In an Airbus, the side stick input will ask the control computers for a specific roll rate horizontally and a pitch or a G-loading vertically. When the pilot sets a specific pitch, the elevators will initiate the pitch and the massive horizontal stabilizer will then move automatically to continue maintaining that pitch without any pilot input. This also means that there is no big tactile feedback from the stick if the aircraft is entering into a strange trim position due to low speed, for example, which would be the case on another aircraft like the 737, for example, that I'm flying. In normal law, that's not an issue because the aircraft also guards the aircraft from getting close to an angle of attack high enough to stall it, but that's not the case in alternate law. Now, these differences are really important for any pilots to know about, but even more crucially, they need to understand them and they need to be able to retrieve this knowledge when things are starting to go wrong. Now, before we get into the actual accident sequence of this video, I just want to share this short message from my sponsor who makes it possible for me to create these videos. This is really quite cool. Are you looking for ways to save a little money on your next holiday or online shopping spree? Well, did you know that you can get cheaper flight tickets, hotel reservations or even car services by connecting to a VPN in a different country? By shopping online with today's sponsor, NordVPN, you can find the best deals in the world no matter where you're shopping from, because it turns out that prices actually change on, for example, Booking.com when connected from a different country. I have no idea why that is, but thanks to NordVPN, you can potentially save some serious bucks by trying it out. Nord have over 5,500 ultra-fast servers in 59 different countries, so there's plenty to choose from. So whether you want to watch your favorite content from other countries, protect your personal information or save money with a VPN via regional discounts, NordVPN have you covered. Start browsing the internet freely and safely today, and right now, if you go to nordvpn.com/pilot, you get an awesome exclusive deal. And you don't really have anything to lose because Nord always gives you a full 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, NordVPN. Now back to the video. As Flight 447 now proceeded along their route, they received a message from their company advising them about reported thunderstorm activity further ahead. The first officer changed the scale on his navigation display and started talking about some build-ups that he could see ahead of them. The pilots then started discussing ways to possibly avoid the turbulence that these clouds would bring, and the first officer indicated that he was quite worried about the storm clouds that he could see now getting closer. At time 01:46, the first officer dimmed the cockpit lights in order to see better outside and confirmed that the aircraft was now entering into a cloud layer. It was pitch black outside with the moon situated behind them, and light turbulence now started rocking the aircraft. The crew discussed if it would be possible to climb higher, as it looked like they were just skimming the tops of the clouds at flight level 350. But when the first officer checked the maximum altitude they could climb to, it was indicated as flight level 370, and they both decided that it wouldn't be a good idea to sit at maximum altitude if the turbulence would get worse. Now, this is probably a good opportunity to discuss another thing that will become important very soon. As an aircraft climbs higher, the air will become thinner and thinner outside. And because of that, depending on the weight of the aircraft as well as the outside temperature and some other factors, the aircraft will be limited from continuing to climb, as the engines just won't be able to produce enough excess thrust to do it. This also means that the engines do not have much excess thrust to deal with any non-normals up there, and because of that, we pilots need to be very careful and quite conservative with how the aircraft is operated. The only way that an aircraft can climb higher than its indicated max altitude would be to exchange kinetic energy, their speed, for potential energy, altitude. But doing so would dramatically increase the angle of attack. At higher altitudes, the critical angle of attack, meaning the angle where the aircraft will stall if it's exceeded, is also less due to aerodynamic effects from flying closer to the speed of sound. So in short, the aircraft will stall earlier and will have less available thrust at higher altitudes. It will also be more sensitive and harder to hand fly due to less air providing aerodynamic damping. After the aircraft had entered into the clouds, the captain started commenting on the appearance of St. Elmo's fire. This is a sure sign of a building electrical charge close to an aircraft, a further indication that they were getting close to storm clouds. Around this time, the captain pressed a button on the overhead panel, which activated a call bell in the crew bunk behind the cockpit. This was the sign to the relief pilot that it was time for him to return to the cockpit and take over for the captain, so the captain could go back to the bunk and get some rest. The relief pilot knocked on the cockpit wall in response to show that he had heard the bell. Now, the Air France standard operating procedures at the time stipulated that the first officer in the right seat, who was pilot flying, would take on the role of piloting command when the captain left for rest, unless something else had been agreed. And in this case, this was exactly what happened, and when the relief pilot arrived to the cockpit at time 01:59, the captain left his chair and listened in to the briefing that the first officer gave to the relief pilot. This briefing included the anticipated turbulence, that they were currently flying in cloud, and that they couldn't climb any higher at the moment. The captain didn't leave any specific instructions about how the two first officers should deal with the thunderstorms ahead. Instead, he left the cockpit to start his rest. Now, we can only speculate to why he didn't give more clear instructions. Like I mentioned before, all three pilots were used to this type of weather and had flown this route many times, so it is likely that he found the two first officers more than capable of dealing with it. When the captain left, the Air France procedures meant that the much more senior relief pilot now took on the role of pilot monitoring in the left seat, and the first officer continued as pilot flying and effectively piloting command. The two pilots now started discussing the weather situation up ahead, and the first officer mentioned the Intertropical Convergence zone. But at this stage, there was no discussion about trying to avoid the cells by changing course. Instead, the first officer asked the relief pilot if he had been able to sleep anything, and the relief pilot said that he'd just dozed off a bit. The relief pilot then asked the first officer if he felt okay. This discussion could be interpreted as the two pilots possibly feeling a bit fatigued at this point. The captain had also made some similar remarks earlier. The relief pilot also left his pilot chair in the aft position and didn't move it forward into the piloting position when he sat down. That would likely have given him a more relaxed position where he could put his feet up, but it wouldn't be ideal if he suddenly needed to fly the aircraft, which he soon would need to do. At time 02:06 and 5 seconds, the first officer contacted the cabin crew to advise them that they would likely encounter some light turbulence soon and to tell them to be careful. It was now around 4 minutes since the captain had left the cockpit, and in another 4 minutes the emergency sequence would begin. The relief pilot now started looking closer at his navigation display, and he reached down and changed the gain on his weather radar to max. This made the weather radar more sensitive and highlighted the weather ahead of them. He then asked the first officer if he maybe wanted to go a bit to the left, indicating some discomfort with what he was seeing in front of them. The first officer asked what he meant, and he then pointed out the return on the screen in front of them and asked again if they could turn left. The first officer agreed and turned the heading bug about 12 degrees to the left. This was a quite small correction given the amount of weather they had in front of them, but it meant that they now left their flight plan route and they didn't try to radio in this change to air traffic control. At time 02:08 and 17 seconds, the cockpit voice recorder picked up a change in the background noise in the cockpit. This noise sounded like rain hitting the cockpit. At the same time, the first officer noticed that the temperature was going up and he asked if the relief pilot had done something with the air conditioning. He then asked, "What's that smell?" The relief pilot recognized the smell as ozone and calmed his colleague down by explaining what ozone was. These comments, as well as the precipitation heard outside the aircraft, were all signs of the type of weather phenomenon the aircraft was now flying into. The change in temperature and humidity felt in the cockpit was likely another sign of huge amounts of water or ice being suddenly sucked into the engines, partially overwhelming the air conditioning system. 20 seconds later, the background noise intensified and changed into a sound of ice crystals now hitting the cockpit. The turbulence intensified and the first officer reduced the commanded speed from Mach 0.82 to 0.8, which was the turbulence penetration speed. This caused the auto throttle to reduce the thrust back to 84% N1. Up until this point, the aircraft had been performing flawlessly and the two pilots were relaxed and just monitoring the autopilot doing its job. We don't know for sure what caused it, but it is very likely that the ice crystals who were now pelting the aircraft outside started to overwhelm the heating elements of the Pitot probes who were providing crucial information to the three air data modules. At time 02:10 and 5 seconds, the autopilot and autothrottle suddenly disconnected with the associated cavalry charge warning in the cockpit. At the same moment, a heavy gust of wind caused the aircraft to start banking sharply to the right. The first officer called out, "I have controls," and reached for his side stick. Now this sudden onset of warnings and aircraft behavior would have likely caused a severe startle to both pilots and the confusion would have set in almost immediately. But at this point, the aircraft was still flying reasonably level, with only this right bank developing. As the aircraft continued banking right, the indicated airspeed on the captain's primary flight display, as well as on the standby indicator, suddenly dropped from 275 knots to 60 knots, a clearly erroneous indication. We don't know for sure what the first officer's instruments showed, as they weren't recorded on the flight data recorder, but they likely also fell with a similar amount. Remember what I told you about how the altimeter system compensated the pressure for higher Mach numbers? Well, because the speed was now indicated as much lower, the altimeter system recalculated its altitude and suddenly showed a drop of 300 feet as well as a negative vertical speed. The first officer, who had been suddenly thrown into hand flying the aircraft, now reacted instinctively by giving left aileron and pitching up to correct his altitude. This was the start of the sequence of events that would ultimately doom this flight. Since all three ADRs were now showing unreliable data, the aircraft reverted into alternate law, which meant that the angle of attack protections were lost, as well as the overspeed and bank protections. Now, like I mentioned before, the roll control now also became about twice as sensitive, meaning that the first officer had to really concentrate in order to get the aircraft to stop banking and return to level flight. He started overcorrecting, and the movements he made with the side stick started causing more oscillations, going from right to left and then back again. It is very possible that most of the first officer's attention went to this part of the handling at this point, but remember, he had also started pitching up. That pitch was now increasing, leading into a very high rate of climb. Almost instantaneously, as the autopilot disconnected and all of the different warnings started, a brief stall warning could also be heard in the cockpit. When the warning sounded, the relief pilot called out, "What is that?" Likely because of the quick nature of the warning, but it could also potentially indicate a confusion about its meaning. The flight directors were not disconnected by the crew, as the procedure for airspeed unreliable instructed them to do, but the command bars disappeared anyway due to lack of reliable data. 11 seconds into the sequence, the pitch of the aircraft had reached 11 degrees nose up, and the first officer was making max left and right side stick inputs, still overcorrecting. He also now called, we haven't got good display," likely referring to the lack of speed info. The relief pilot, who was supposed to handle the ECAM warnings and the non-normal checklist, called out, "We've lost the speeds and alternate low protection low." He then continued to read out the ECAM messages, but in a manner that was hard to understand and very rushed. Here, it would have been absolutely crucial to clearly point out that the aircraft was in alternate law, meaning that it would handle differently and that certain protections were lost. He mentioned that the auto thrust was lost, and the first officer responded by asking, engine lever? Showing some confusion about what the relief pilot was saying. Since the auto throttle had disconnected when the failure occurred, the thrust had gone into a mode called engine thrust locked, which basically meant that it was keeping its previously selected value of 84%. ECAM instructed the crew to move the thrust lever manually to resume thrust control, but instead the first officer pushed the auto throttle disconnect button and left the thrust lever where it was, which was in the climb detent. And because of that, the thrust now started to increase into climb thrust. All of what I've said so far happened in the first 18 seconds of this emergency. There were 10 different ECAM messages showing up, each of them causing a chime in the cockpit. On top of this, the master warning and the master caution light was illuminated in front of the pilots, as well as a constant C-chord chime, indicating that the aircraft had left its cleared altitude. This would have been a very confusing and stressful environment for the pilots. And the fact that unreliable airspeed was not indicated on the ECAM, this was something that the pilots needed to figure out themselves. That might have been the reason why they didn't start executing that procedure at that point. At time 02:10 and 26 seconds, the aircraft pitch-up attitude had reached 12 degrees nose up. The aircraft was now climbing with a hair-raising 6,900 feet per minute, more than 7 times higher than the normal rate would be as it passed 36,000 feet. Maintaining a rate this high meant that the aircraft was now rapidly exchanging speed for altitude. Suddenly, the flight director bars reappeared in front of the first officer, but instead of being engaged in the altitude hold mode that they were before, they're now engaged in vertical speed mode, since they activated in the middle of a climb. This meant that the flight directors were now starting to show the pilots the pitch needed to maintain their current 6,000 feet per minute climb. That would definitely not have been helpful in this situation, when the first officer was likely becoming more and more overloaded by noise and workload. And it was precisely because of this that the unreliable airspeed memory items included turning off the flight directors. The relief pilot now looked away from the ECAM display, which he had stopped reading anyway, and reached to switch on the wing anti-ice. And that's when he noticed the high pitch that the aircraft was keeping. He called out, "Watch your speed," possibly referring to the vertical speed, since the speed indication still hadn't returned. The first officer replied, okay, I'm going back down," and started pitching forward, but not nearly enough. This only reduced the climb rate, but the aircraft continued to climb. The relief pilot continued to call out that he needed to stabilize, go back down, and according to all three, you are going up, so go back down, to which the first officer responded, "Okay." The pitch now momentarily reduced to about 10 degrees pitch up, which still gave a climb rate of about 4,000 feet per minute. They now climbed through their calculated max altitude of 37,000 feet, and at time 02:10 and 36 seconds, the flight directors disappeared again, but the airspeed came back on the left side, indicating the correct speed of 223 knots. That meant that up until this point, the aircraft had lost about 50 knots of pressurized airspeed, and the speed was still reducing. The flight directors again flashed up for about a second, disappeared, and then came back again, commanding a climb of about 1,400 feet per minute, which was what the aircraft was doing at that time. At time 02:10 and 47 seconds, the first officer inexplicably now reduced the thrust back to around 85% N1. And this is likely a sign of his increasing loss of situational awareness and disorientation. The relief pilot pushed the call button to try and get the captain back into the cockpit again. He pressed it several times, asking, "Where is he?" He also reached over and switched the air data selector and the attitude heading selector to first officer on 3. These are switches designed to change the data input for the displays, and they were not items covered in any checklist. He likely switched these in an attempt to try and restore the instrument that he felt were missing for the first officer. 3 seconds later, the stall warning went off in the cockpit and sounded continuously for the next 45 seconds. The fact that this warning was now sounding continuously was not verbalized or even discussed by any of the pilots. Instead, the first officer reacted by pulling back on the controls, increasing the pitch attitude to 16 degrees nose up, similar to what you would have on takeoff. This pitch-up command now also meant that the stabilizer at the back of the aircraft started moving into the max nose-up position, making a potential recovery even harder. The aircraft now no longer had enough energy to keep the requested climb rate. Instead, it started to slowly level off, rocking from side to side, which the first officer desperately tried to counteract with the side stick. They were now rapidly closing in on a fully developed stall. Now, a stall happens when the aircraft wing has moved beyond its critical angle of attack, meaning that it effectively stops being able to create lift, and instead the aircraft will start to fall. A stall can happen at any altitude. The only thing that determines when it happens is the angle of attack, and the angle of attack is the angle between the wing chord line and the oncoming airflow. Both pilots had received initial training on how to deal with an approach to stall and recovery during the type ratings years ago, but they would have never experienced the feeling of a fully developed stall in the real aircraft. The fact that the Airbus only has an audio warning, not a visual stall indication in front of the pilots or a stick shaker, might also have played a part in explaining why the warning wasn't reacted to, because one of the first things that disappears when a human is under stress is their hearing. At time 02:10 and 57 seconds, the aircraft reached its stall angle of attack and violent buffeting started to shake the aircraft. This type of buffeting is of a much higher frequency than turbulence is, and it feels very different. The first officer now added full toga thrust, but at this altitude, above the aircraft's maximum performance altitude, the engines were not able to produce enough thrust to even keep the speed, much less accelerate it. The relief pilot called out, above all, try to touch the lateral controls as little as possible, showing some insight into the issues with flying in alternate law. But this fell on deaf ears as the first officer continued to make max left and right inputs. The relief pilot also said, "Is he coming or not?" referring to the captain. The first officer now called out, "I'm in toga," referring to the fact that he had added thrust, which he might have thought would be enough to solve the situation. The aircraft still climbed a few hundred feet more until it reached its maximum recorded altitude of 37,924 feet, and then it started falling down towards the sea below. Now you might ask yourselves, why didn't the relief pilot just take controls? He was asking for corrections that didn't happen. Well, we will never know the answer to that, but it likely lies in the fact that this all happened quite fast. It only took about 1 minute to reach this point. Also, the fact that he couldn't see or feel the input his colleague was making on the side stick, since those aren't connected to each other in the Airbus, made it hard to monitor what his colleague was actually doing. At time 02:11 and 7 seconds, the last bit of ice inside of the Pitot tubes had been cleared by the heating elements, and both the standby and left airspeed indicator now started working again. The speed indicated was 183 knots, meaning that they had lost around 90 knots of airspeed. The aircraft now entered into an increasingly rapid descent, with the stall warning sounding continuously. The relief pilot called out, "But we've got the engines, what's happening?" And then, "Do you understand what's happening?" But he got no reply. The aircraft started banking over towards the right, which prompted the first officer to give continuous left side stick, but with very little effect. The first officer also continued his pitch up command with his side stick and would be doing that continuously for the next 40 seconds. Now, for all of those out there who cannot believe how it was possible for the first officer to react this way, there are a few things that are worth thinking about. The first is that the human brain does not perform well under stress, and we tend to revert to our training when that happens. And that brings me to my second point, which is how the Airbus functions when it's flown in normal law. You see, the best possible climb performance you can get from the aircraft is achieved through applying continuous back pressure and toga thrust. That's what's used during a wind shear or a terrain escape maneuver, for example. Since the aircraft will not allow it to stall, it will only pitch to maintain close to its maximum angle of attack, whilst using max thrust, giving the best possible performance. But that only works in normal law. If you apply that logic, the actions of the overstressed first officer becomes maybe a little bit more understandable. At time 02:11 and 32 seconds, the first officer called out that he didn't have control of the aircraft anymore, no control at all. The relief pilot responded by saying, "Controls to the left," and pressed the takeover button to take controls, but he never verbalized that takeover formally. He then made 2 brief inputs to the left of his own controls before the first officer took back the controls again and continued with his own inputs, aft and left, none of which was working. At this point, the aircraft descent rate had increased to around 10,000 feet per minute, and the angle of attack was close to 40 degrees, meaning that the aircraft was now more falling than flying. Because it was maintaining such an incredibly high angle of attack, the air was now hitting the aircraft from below at a 40 to 60 degree angle. This would have caused a very strange wind noise in the cockpit, but also crucially, the angle that the air was hitting the pitot tubes and the static ports with was now so extreme that the pressure became almost equal on both. This meant that the speed indication once again disappeared as the computer interpreted those conditions as being completely impossible and unreliable. So the reason that the crew now once again found themselves without valid speed indication had nothing to do with ice from this point on. It was only due to their extreme aircraft situation. Once the speed value dropped below 60 knots, the onboard computers told the stall warning system to disregard the angle of attack vanes outside, because such a speed could only be encountered on the ground. This made the stall warning stop in the cockpit, and as the calculated speed fell below 30 knots, the speed indication was replaced by speed flags on the pilot display. At this point, the first officer also said something that gives a bit of an insight to why he was acting the way he did. He said, "I have the impression that we have the speed." It's unclear what he was basing this feeling on, but it could be just his senses together with the increase in wind noise from outside and possibly the buffeting that he was feeling. In any case, the silencing of the stall warning coincided with the captain returning to the cockpit at time 02:11 and 42 seconds. That was about 1 minute and a half after the autopilot disconnected and less than 1 minute after he was called back. He was faced with a completely unrealistic scene. There was no stall warning at this point for the reason that I just explained, but the aircraft was descending with an incredible vertical speed and they were just passing 35,000 feet, the same altitude they had maintained when he left the cockpit. The pitch attitude was varying between 15 degrees nose up and 9 degrees nose down, and he could see 10 different ECAM warnings, master warning lights, together with severe buffeting which was shaking the aircraft. The captain asked, "What are you doing?" To which the relief pilot desperately answered, "What's happening? Well, I don't know what's happening." The first officer also chimed in, "We're losing control of the aircraft here," and the relief pilot added, "We've lost all control of the airplane. We don't understand anything. We've tried everything." The first officer now reduced the engines to idle, and given their position below the wings, this and some actual pitch down commands finally caused the aircraft to pitch down to about 11 degrees below the horizon. The first officer said, "I have a problem. It's that I don't have vertical speed. I have no more displays." And the relief pilot said, "We have no valid indications." The vertical speed indication might have been indicating full down at this point, or it could indeed be missing as the computer rendered any value above 20,000 feet per minute as invalid. But the fact that they were now finally pitching down caused the speed to start increasing and the angle of attack to decrease slightly. But in a cruel twist of fate, because the speed now started increasing, the stall warning system again noticed that it had valid indications and started sounding, giving the perverse effect of indicating a stall when the nose was pitching down, but disappearing again when it was pitched back up. This must have been extremely confusing for the pilots, but fully in line with the aircraft system design at the time, because no aircraft was ever thought to even get close to that kind of situation that they now found themselves in. The first officer now said, "I have the impression that we have some crazy speed. What do you think?" He then reached over and deployed the speed brake, but was immediately told to stow it again by his colleagues. Now, this further indicates that the first officer indeed thought that the aircraft was in an overspeed and not in the fully developed stall that they actually were. As the pilots were now trying to troubleshoot, the aircraft was descending with between 10 to 15,000 feet per minute, with the nose oscillating between 8 degrees nose down and 15 degrees nose up. Each time it pitched down, the stall warning would activate, and when it pitched up again, it would silence. The bank angle varied between 20 and 40 degrees to the right, and it's likely that it was mostly the yaw damper which was controlling the rudder who kept the aircraft from going into a spin. At time 02:12 and 10 seconds, the thrust was again moved into the climb detent, and 20 seconds later, the aircraft stopped banking to the right and instead started oscillating left and right, which the first officer continued to try and correct with his side stick. The relief pilot asked the captain, "What do you think?" What do we need to do? But the captain, who had not been informed about the nature of the initial failure, nor about the rapid climb in the beginning of the emergency, was completely perplexed. He just answered, "There, I don't know, there it's going down." Clearly, just trying to orient himself of what he was seeing on the different instruments. In the following seconds, there are a lot of confused call-outs from all three pilots. The first officer, who was still in control, was asking things like, "Am I going down now?" To which the relief pilot responded, "Go down," and the captain, "No, you're climbed there," most likely referring to his pitch attitude, not to what the aircraft was actually doing. At some point here, the first officer actually positions the side stick fully forward for a few seconds. This causes a pitch down and the speed to start increasing, and with that, stall warning came back and the first officer confirms the engines to be in toga. This is again an indication of this being his go-to response for the stall warning. He then asked, "What do we have on Alti?" referring to the altimeter reading, which was about 20,000 feet at this point. Now this is a bit strange, since he should be seeing his altitude in front of him, but unfortunately we cannot be sure if the first officer had any valid instruments at all in front of him, since the flight data recorder didn't capture it. Later examinations of the different failure modes in the computers seems to indicate that he did have it. The captain muttered, "It's impossible," showing that he still couldn't figure out what was going on. During the following seconds, the pilots kept discussing the attitude of the aircraft and how to get the wings horizontal. The confusion is obvious and excruciating to listen to. The first officer explained that he is at the limit with the roll controls, and the captain then suggested that he could use a bit of left rudder to try to stop the right bank. This actually seemed to help momentarily as the aircraft rolled over slightly to the left, but soon continued banking right again. The aircraft descended through 10,000 feet and the first officer called out, we're there, we're passing level 100. At this point, there was likely very little the pilot could have done to save this aircraft. But the relief pilot now called out, wait, me, I have controls, and then started making left inputs, but the first officer never let go of his control, so the warning
dual input
was now heard multiple times for the coming seconds. The first officer called out, how come we're continuing to go down? And as he was saying this, the relief pilot instructed the captain to try and reset the flight control computers, which he did, but the captain also said that it wouldn't make any difference. The relief pilot then started calling out, climb, 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 to which the first officer responded, but I've been at max nose up for a while. That last remark likely finally made the captain understand what was going on, and he called out, no, don't climb. The relief pilot said, so go down, and pushed his side stick forward, but the first officer was still holding his side stick backwards, causing a new dual input warning. And since the two inputs were now averaged, nothing happened. The relief pilot called out, so give me the controls to me, controls to me. First officer responded, go ahead, you have the controls, we're still in toga. The nose was now lowered 7 degrees below the horizon and the speed indication came back together with another stall warning. 7 seconds later, despite having given the controls to the relief pilot, the first officer again started pulling back on the controls, causing another dual input alert. The thrust levels was also momentarily pulled back to idle and then moved forward again, likely to try and achieve any type of change to the situation. The captain called out from the jump seat, watch out, you're pitching up there. But it now seems like the relief pilot had changed his mind about the strategy, because he called out, I'm pitching up. And when the captain continued to warn about doing that, he responded, well, we need to do it, we're at 4,000 feet. The next thing that could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder was the GPWS system calling out,
sink rate, pull up,
as the aircraft fell through 2,500 feet. This caused the captain to also change his mind, and he called out, go on, pull, as the first officer chimed in, let's go, pull up, pull up, pull up. Both pilots now pulled maximum back on their side stick, causing the nose to pitch up 16 degrees above the horizon. The speed at this point was 107 knots forward, but an equal heart-wrenching 107 knots downwards. At time 02, 14 and 22 seconds, the first officer again pushed his takeover button and kept it pressed. This locked out the control from the relief pilot. The synthetic cockpit voice recorder called out,
priority right.
The first officer now pulled in panic back and called out, damn, we're going to crash, followed by, this can't be true. And What's happening?" The captain barked out an order. 10 degrees pitch up, while the stall and GPWS warnings were blaring in the background. The relief pilot now tried for the last time to pitch forward, but since the first officer was holding the takeover button, his inputs had no effect. Even if they would have, this was far too late to do anything about the situation. At time 02:14 and 28 seconds, the Airbus 330 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean at a 45-degree angle and a vertical speed of 10,900 feet per minute. The forces exerted on the airframe was equivalent to someone being dropped from the 46th floor of a building straight into the ground. It immediately shattered the aircraft into thousands of pieces, and all 228 people on board were immediately lost. Completely unaware of the horrific fate of the aircraft, the 4 control centers that were planned to be in contact with the flight soon started contacting each other to verify if anyone had heard anything from the aircraft. It soon became clear that there had been no sign from the flight since time 01:35, and the crew hadn't checked in at the various position checkpoints that they should have. Since the problem with HF radio contact was not uncommon in this part of the Atlantic Ocean, no one took any particular notice of this for the first few hours. There continued to be several calls made between the different ATC centers verifying if anything had been heard, and other aircraft flying on the same route were asked to try and contact the flight, but with no success. The same went for trying to contact them via SATCOM, which is a type of satellite telephone, as well as ACARS messages sent from Air France. 3 hours after the accident, the flight was first registered as missing, and a further 3 hours later the first emergency message was sent out by Madrid in Spain, and as well as from Senegalese ATC control centers. This triggered the first search and rescue planes to be sent out towards the last known location of the aircraft. On the 2nd of June 2009, 2 days after the accident, the first floating debris was spotted on the ocean surface, and 3 days later the first debris and victims were recovered from the sea. This was the beginning of a 2-year-long search and rescue effort that included charting the entire underwater terrain in the area where the aircraft was thought to have gone down. The search was divided into several campaigns, with the last one starting in March of 2011, and on the 2nd of April that year, the wreckage was finally located on a relatively flat area at the sea floor at a depth of about 12,800 feet and 6.5 miles away from its last ACARS transmitted position. This meant that thousands of pieces could be recovered, including both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, which were miraculously in good condition. The fact that both recorders were found was what finally led to the final report and the details that I've just told you. So, what conclusions did the final report bring? Why did this horrible accident actually happen? Well, the fact was that no component on the aircraft actually failed. But the pitot tubes and their heating elements were temporarily overwhelmed by external factors that were likely outside of what they had been certified for. This then led to a loss of reliable airspeed, and that in turn caused a cascade of temporary system degradations, warnings and autopilot disconnections that caused a severe startle to the operating crew. The crew was expected to apply the procedure for unreliable airspeed, but never did so. Instead, the initial pitch-up reaction by the pilot flying led to a continuously worsening energy situation, which was discovered late by the pilot monitoring. The subsequent corrections were too small, leading to the aircraft exiting the flight performance envelope and entering into a sustained stall. This fact was not understood by the pilot, most likely because of lack of training, but possibly also because they might have thought that the warning was erroneous since it didn't match their mental model of what was going on. In any case, the stall conditions was never discussed or verbalized by the pilots during the whole sequence. The lack of identification of that stall meant that the crew never initiated any countermeasures against it. This accident sent shockwaves through the aviation industry and led to several safety recommendations, including the formation of a formal upset prevention and recovery technique training module for all pilots out there. That included the effects of high altitude flying and stall recoveries. It also led to new memory items for flight with unreliable airspeed, which are now focused on disconnecting automatics and setting correct pitch and power immediately to keep the aircraft flying safe before starting any troubleshooting. The investigation also recommended the insertion of a camera in the cockpit to show all instruments indications, as well as several other recommendations around the Pitot probes, black boxes, the Airbus stall warning system, as well as search and rescue improvements. Several other recommendations were also made, but the most important lessons that we pilots need to take away from this accident are that we really need to understand the aircraft that we're flying. That means understanding all of the systems, what happens if those systems are degraded, and also how the aircraft might react differently when flying at high altitude versus at low altitude. And lastly, never forget to continue to fly the aircraft. If a startle happens, remember that pitch and power will keep you safe. Keep the aircraft flying, and only after that try to figure out what has actually happened. As long as the aircraft is flying, there will be plenty of time to troubleshoot. As always, this story was based on the accident final report, but due to its complexity and the many human factors involved, I've also used several other sources, and I want to especially mention Understanding Air France 447 by Bill Palmer, which was instrumental in broadening my system's understanding of the Airbus 330. I highly recommend it. Now, check out this video next or binge on this playlist. Consider subscribing to the channel if you think that I've earned it, and if you want to support the work that we do here, then consider becoming part of my awesome Patreon crew or buy yourself some merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.